welcome to Screentone Club, episode 7, recorded on the 30th of September 2018, and this will be releasing on the 2nd of October. My name is Elliot Page, and I'm joined as always by my lovely co-host, Mr. Andy Hanley. How you doing, Andy?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. I feel like I'm a light novel protagonist who's just hit his second volume.
So you're ready for everything to either repeat the plot exactly of the first volume or absolute hell to be visited upon you, right?
Exactly. Like I've overcome some issues, some dilemmas, but I know there are plenty more ahead that are probably going to be worse and potentially more boring and repetitive. So yeah, I'm ready for this.
But at least you know for sure that 2 more girls are going to appear out of nowhere and set up shop in your front room for some reason.
Yeah, perhaps a little less convinced about that part of it, but we shall see.
Hey man, we all need our childhood friends and all that malarkey. God, we've got plenty of childhood friends to be talking about on this. Anyway, so this is Screentone Club, a fortnightly look at manga with a focus on joint discussion. We're going to be keeping this show tight, although admittedly this week I have quite a few quote-unquote opinions about the things we've talked about, or we're going to be talking about even. And we have one quick thing to talk about before we get to this episode's discussions. It's not returning champions. We would normally shove that in here, but this is a bit of housekeeping and general sort of podcast maintenance. And this is, well, I suppose you could see this coming given the way that every podcast handles things now, but we are launching a Patreon. We don't really like adverts, to cut to the chase. And so we have plans to enhance this show, expand it, cover our hosting costs, cover the cost of buying books. Also, hopefully in the future, pay an actual producer who knows what they're doing with audio, so it's not just me bumbling around Audacity. Also, if it works out well, we can always take the podcast to a fully weekly basis rather than the current fortnightly basis. So for just $1 a month, you can support the show, and you'll also get free extra content. So thank you to patrons. We will have a monthly bonus episode, which will cover a title that you get to vote on if you pledge over $3 a month. So then this way, if you want to recommend us a title or basically force us to read something, you totally can. But yeah, full details available. There'll be a link on the notes of this podcast file and also on the website, screentone.club. Hope you'll consider maybe even for a second chipping in a little bit. Even if it's only $1 a month, it really helps because that helps, frankly, put away our hosting bills for good. But yeah, as mentioned, like it's either this or we do podcast adverts, and I'm pretty sure that every last person on the planet is now sick of being sold razors, berries, meal in a box, or stupid-ass mattresses. I know for a fact that I am well done with them. But yeah, so that's our general idea. As I mentioned, we'll find more details on the website. Don't worry, the main podcast itself is not going anywhere. The main sort of Screentone Club podcast will always be free and available for you to consume as much as you'd like. So don't worry about that. But yeah, that's basically the little bit of quick hawking out the way. And so now we can move on to, well, the main part of the show, the actual manga, the bit you come here for, I guess. So do you want to go first, Andy, this time?
Yeah, let's do that. I feel like we have opinions as mentioned on both of these, so let's start with the one that I feel may have slightly fewer opinions, just to get it out of the way.
I don't know, man. I have some opinions.
Okay. You've set the bar high already. Yeah, so my pick for this podcast was Sayonara Football, which is a 2-volume series from Naoshi Arakawa, who is previously known and best known as the author of Your Lie in April, which is pretty much why I picked it, because Your Lie in April is all kinds of fantastic, and it's a kind of romantic drama and melodrama that I can kind of get behind. So I was curious to see this author turning her hands to a short but sweet manga about football, which is also something that is very close to my heart. So it's like, what could possibly go wrong? And so Sayonara Football it's kind of a bit of a stop me if you've heard this one before in terms of narratives about football, because basically it's about a girl who wants to play football for a boys' team. As the cover of both volumes of this rather succinctly put it, she is a cute footballer. And so Nozomi Onda, the main character, is really good at football, but she goes to a school that basically has kind of no real visibility in terms of like a girls' football team. And so she kind of, kicks around quite literally with the boys' team. And she wants to play in this newcomers tournament that is coming up. But basically nobody's going to let her because she's a girl and that's kind of against the rules. And also there's a lot of kind of concern that when she, as skillful as she is when it comes to a competitive game, she's basically going to get kicked off the park by all these boys that are kind of bigger and stronger than her. And for much of or for a significant part of the first volume, there's not really any hint as to why she's so absolutely desperate to play in this game. Clearly she loves football, so she wants to play because of that. But there's a very clear undertone that there's more to it than that. And eventually that comes to the fore, that basically she wants to play against a guy on the team that the school has been drawn against, because it's a boy that used to kind of follow her around, and she basically used to bully this kid and kind of bully him into playing with her and playing football with her. And he has grown up from kind of a diminutive and kind of slightly chubby fellow into a pretty strong centre-half, a pretty strong central defender. And so kind of the scene is set for the inevitable. Onda ends up getting into the team by hook or by crook with a kind of a really dumb but kind of fun plot twist that I rolled my eyes at and then thought, you know what, actually, I'm okay with that. And so kind of a lot of the second volume is focused on this big game in this newcomers tournament between these sort of two friends / rivals, and some of Onda's teammates who are kind of love rivals of their own in that sense. And it kind of goes exactly where you'd expect it to. It focuses entirely really on this one game, like it doesn't try to spin out into anything more grandiose. It's really all about this one match and how things end up. And the ending is kind of a little bit flat because it doesn't really go in any particular direction. It kind of ends in a slightly bittersweet way, but there's no kind of massive drama or payoff, which is a little bit frustrating. But I don't know, like, I'm in a strange place with this manga, mostly because it plays to a very particular nostalgia for me. Because as somebody who's always been a football fan, like I have memories of my childhood of kind of back in the day when I was young, many, many, many years ago now, he says with a sigh. Like whenever you used to walk into your local newsagent, you used to see kind of basically two big kind of segments of comics beyond all the usual stuff. And there were kind of comics for boys that were basically broken down into two things. There was one set of comics that were all about World War II and kind of all that war stuff. And then there was a whole tranche of comics. I think they were literally just called Football. And they were just all these kind of random football stories that are very kind of reminiscent of this, like not the kind of girl that wants to play in a boys team, but they were all very much about like, oh, hey, here's this individual football player, or sometimes it was about a team and, you know, they really want to play in the big game in inverted commas. And then there'd be a bunch of drama building up to that. And then there'd be a whole kind of segment seeing that game actually play out and kind of the on-pitch drama of, you know, and there goes my phone, of kind of near misses and, you know, goals scored and the final result and all of that. And I feel like a lot of my kind of enjoyment of this came perhaps less from the story kind of inherent in Sayonara Football and more out of the nostalgia for like, oh yeah, I used to really love reading those stories. And this feels a lot like one of those. So I think like I very much ended up reading this manga through rose-tinted spectacles in terms of I'm enjoying this, but in this very strange and particular way. So I think story-wise, like that's why I'm really interested to hear your take on this, Elliot, because like I feel like you're probably going to come at it from a very different angle. So yeah, story-wise, it was kind of that was really where it hit me. I do really like the artwork of it. Like the character designs are pretty strong, and again, very much if you've read or watched the anime adaptation of Your Lie in April, like, you know, you kind of know what you're getting as far as that stuff goes. Like Onda herself is very reminiscent of Tsubaki in Your Lie in April in terms of both kind of personality and kind of design. But there's some really good illustration of the actual football stuff as well. Like football in anime and manga can often be really clunky, and kind of as somebody who watches a lot of football, like you can just look at it and instantly like, no, that's wrong. It's just like the body positions and shapes and the way people are kicking the ball is all wrong. Whereas this doesn't always nail it, but more often than not, it gets it right in a really satisfying way. Like there are some really good kind of either multiple panels or just kind of single panels where you have this sort of like ghost effectively of Onda, where you can kind of see her kind of collecting the ball and kind of just like flicking it off the outside of her foot and spinning and turning. And all of that stuff was really satisfying to me because it looks like proper football. And kind of likewise, in terms of the writing, like some of the terminology is bang on. And some of it, you can never tell whether it's like a localization issue or what, because you have that age-old problem where they talk about goals as points.
Yeah, I was going to mention that straight off because that was the thing that pulled me out of it every time.
Yeah, so stuff like that is really annoying. But at the same time, it also makes some good kind of football references. Like there's a point where they reference to Onda basically doing an Eric Cantona and kind of kung fu kicking a supporter at one of her games because she got pissed off at them. And there are a bunch of other kind of like football-like references, which again, like it would be easy for the author to just like, I don't know, find that randomly on Wikipedia and say, hey, that's a good football thing. But it kind of added a little bit of flavor for me as a football fan. I'm just like, yeah, this feels at least like they're making the effort to you know, feel like they actually care about the sport. So yeah, but visually I really liked it. Story-wise, it was okay for what it was, but nothing spectacular. It just happened to hook into a particular nostalgia of mine.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, so kind of jumping on the nostalgia or sort of where coming from train. I mean, I was never really into football as a kid. The closest I came was the like Merlin's stickers, which was kind of precluding a horrific adult sort of fascination with gacha games, I suppose. So
yeah,
that's where that came from.
Yeah, I suspect there's a whole generation that have that deep-seated issue if we go back far enough. It's like, oh yeah, fucking sticker albums are the cause of all of our idle game, etc. woes now.
Almost, yeah. I feel like there's definitely a line you can draw there. But even so, like, even though I was not deeply into football, like I've grown up in a town and in a culture that greatly reveres football. Like hell, I went to see England versus Germany one time. I think it was on the Euro tournaments. It was on at Wembley. I forget. I don't know. I was like, all I remember from that evening was I got teased mercilessly because Mum packed me a carrot in my lunch, and so all the kids nearby saw it and laughed their heads off. So jerks. So yeah, I mean, I'm with you on the translation thing. Just as a first off thing, is that when they mentioned points, kind of pulled me out. But equally, like as someone who's not fully into football, I found the constant references to like footballing names kind of grating, where it's like, yeah, I get it. You know about football. I don't care. Like these references don't really help with what's on the page and what I want to see. Anyway, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So in a general thing, I'm extremely on this manga, like extremely. Like when I started reading it, it felt like a find or a place on Your Lie in April, which is partly because I hold that series in very high esteem. Also because obviously it's by the same author, so the art looks very similar, unsurprisingly. And like some of the character archetypes and structures are there in place. And so it became a case of like, I can't remember this character's name, but I can definitely remember their like alternate number in Your Lie in April, which is maybe more a sign that series hangs quite heavy above my head. But it took me a while to get into it and really care. Partially because it constantly, to me, shifted between these two focuses that it keeps jumping between. I don't know, maybe they blended better for you, Andy. I'd like to hear what you thought about it. Where it was, you know, the main plot, the one I cared about, is about Onda and her childhood friendship and, like, meeting Namek again and getting to know and seeing what's happened and just wanting to be into football because she's been off the pitch for, like, a year because her school does not have a girls' team. And the coach is very much stuck in the mud, even though he's having his cake and eating it in a writing sense as well, where he's like, oh, yes, Sonda, you can revolutionize women's soccer in Japan. And I'm like, where the fuck did that come from? You were totally against her even touching a football for the first volume of this manga. And the second part that I don't care about, and I actively found very annoying by the end, is like this sort of call, this hearkening to women's football and soccer in Japan in general. And like, you know, name dropping famous footballers and saying, oh, Onda could revolutionize women's soccer. And I'm like, where the dick did this come from? And like, if you really wanted her to do that, wouldn't you have put her in a team, even if you had to put her in a wig? Like, it's really irritating where I just did not care anything, a single iota for the larger plot line. And like, it sounds real mean, even as someone who like wants to imagine himself as being a feminist, but the larger gender politics of it, did not care. Like every single time it's like, oh, you know, differences in biology. And it's like, yes, I get it. You can stop mentioning this now. You're done. And I don't know, maybe it was just me, but like the way it kept blending those two together, where I wanted to see the characters play out. And I like you mentioned, the ending falls somewhat flat for me because it does turn into this weird thing, grasping for like, oh yeah, don't worry, Onda will become a legend in time. And it's like, I don't care. I just want to see her sort out this weird tangled polygon of friendships she has. Like, I'd rather just see that end up. And thankfully, it does give me part of that when it has some degree of resolution with showing you her like childhood friend Namek and his side of things, which also comes in what feels like a bit too late to actually revive his character and not make him a complete prick. So I don't know, was that just me, Andy? Like, well, I just found that element of it very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm certainly with you kind of like on the gender politics angle. Like it really kind of lays that on thick as something that it's gonna tackle, and then it doesn't really do anything particularly interesting with it. So like that side of things was certainly a disappointment. I mean, I think the bigger problem that it has with a lot of the kind of the emotional and the relationship stuff is just really it's painted itself into a corner with the way it writes Onda's character. Because again, like to make the Tsubaki from Your Lie in April kind of comparison, like those two characters start out from exactly the same place of being kind of like, they're tomboys, they just want to be one of the boys and do all the stuff that they do, and you know they want to, you know, slide around in the mud, whatever it is. But the difference is that, and maybe it's just down to like the amount of time it has to play with, but like Tsubaki from Your Lie in April kind of gets to the point where she kind of figures out and reconciles like her feelings about various people and like what they actually mean. Like she goes from being kind of clueless to just like, yeah, I know, I hang out with this kind of childhood friend of mine, but I don't really know why, like, you know, and kind of goes from that, yeah, he's just this annoying kid who like has glommed onto me, to like, actually no, like there's more to it than that. Whereas kind of Onda in this series never reaches that kind of level of realization. Like at the end of it, she still is basically as clueless about everybody's feelings for her and about her feelings for other people as she is at the start, more or less. Like there's very little movement on that front, and I think that's where the frustration is, because, you know, she learns nothing really. And I think that's kind of the football focus of her being, you know, a revolution for women's soccer is almost kind of what drops in place of what you actually want, which is that sense of realization of just like, oh wait, like this is what my passion for playing in this game actually represented, and like I learned something about myself. But that shoe never really seems to drop.
I don't know, I'd say from the football side of things, Onda does have that shoe drop moment when she stops trying to butt heads and like forgive me, but play like a boy. And then she rediscovers the beautiful soccer she fell in love with, which is a weird ass backwards way it's presented as well, because it kind of presents you the reasoning before it actually presents you how it actually goes about, which is real wild, because it's like, why is this like it feels like it does this several times where it gets the flashbacks the wrong way around. Like, even at the very start of it, you're like, why is this girl so cut up about this? Because it starts in medias res, because of course you are. And it's just this weird cycle where it's like, okay, what, you know, you're always constantly having to catch up to what Onda wants. And like, if anything, I'm kind of happy with Onda just being a clueless person who wants to play a game of football and like wants to try and figure out her feelings, having met her old childhood friend, who completely lost his awesome curly hair. What the fuck? Curly hair wielders unite and all that. But like, it's so weird. The thing is with Onda is that there is no development for her in the emotional sphere, because that's not what she's looking for. But equally, it doesn't quite fill that in, because everyone else is orbiting the same old anime orbits. Like, hell, she has a pair of other boys on the team who both like her and have this weirdo, like, nudging each other in the ribs competition, which neither, like, one of them does a pseudo, like, confession to her on the pitch, but it's all superfluous and doesn't make a dent because there's no time for any of it, 'cause it's a 2-volume manga. And so the entire, like, the two other boys who like her on the team are basically like this combination Greek chorus / utterly useless characters that kind of, they just feel like they're there because they have to be there because anime sports romance or something. I don't know. Like they just completely did not need to be there at all. So that's what also irritated me because like, you know, if anything, it's more of a story about like Namek, you know, the childhood friend reconciling his point of view and like his like childhood weird bullying history, which, you know, is something he cherishes, and Onda herself working it out. And I feel like at the end of the match they play, there is a resolution there, but because it's been mixed up with all this other romance sort of level stuff, it really muddies the waters in what it's trying to show. And then, of course, it brings in the whole like, oh, this girl can revolutionize soccer. And it's like, where the dick did that come from? So
Yeah.
for me, yeah, so that's the thing is, so initially I just didn't like this. I didn't like this manga. Like I didn't like it. I wanted to like Onda, but it was, no, I didn't know what the hell she was about. And then finally, towards the end of the first volume, it all kind of comes into actual relief, and you get an actual, like when the twist happens, which honestly, I was about to give up on the manga, and then the twist happens, and I'm like, okay, you've got me. Like, this is really stupid, but you've got me, because this is cool enough and interesting enough to be hilarious. And also, quite frankly, if you look back, it's really well signposted. The twist is real good. But before that, I'm like, what the hell? And then when the twist happens and you get the rest of the second volume, and it gets way more into like Onda actually working through everything through her action on the pitch, and that element of it is way more gratifying, even though some of the, as you mentioned, like some of the translation, localization, or the script itself, I don't quite know where it's coming in. It's really clunky. Like some of the phrases people yell at each other on the pitch just come off as real weird. And it's like, okay, I don't think, like, I get it. Maybe the person translating it or the person reading might not be that au fait with football, but as someone who like has just a culturally osmosed knowledge of football, it comes off real wild. But I don't know, to go back to the characters, that was my basic feeling about it. Sorry, I've combined like 4 things there, but again, like a lot of the characters, like the 2 male characters didn't need to be there. And that's what kind of soured me, because it drags it all into this realm of romance polygon.
Yeah. I mean, again, like those 2 characters that you speak of, yeah, like there's nothing to kind of build them, and this is also getting back to a thing that's been my kind of complaint du jour on a lot of these podcasts when we talk about romance stuff, is like you've got to sell me on why character A likes character B, and this is another example where that doesn't really happen. It just kind of plonks these 2 guys in there, and it's just like, yeah, I know they like her, and it kind of, it at least tries to verbalize it a little bit, but it doesn't do it enough to kind of justify them being there, as you say. And it kind of feels, again, like a lot of things about this, when it comes down to it, it feels a little bit by the numbers.
Yeah, it totally does, because it feels like everything in between the bits where it shines feels like filler. Like again, the two boys who like her but don't say anything ever. Well, one of them does, but it's kind of tossed off immediately. The coach being a weird impediment, but also thinking she's great. The one character I think who got the most short shrift actually is the manager character, like Onda's childhood friend, her other childhood friend, who is like her. Like I feel like in a different universe, there's basically a Yuri manga written about that poor girl and her unrequited friendship, like maybe more than that, just going on. Like, that poor lass has hung on forever around Onda as her bestest friend, and like even became manager of the football club. Like it's real wild. There's an entire story in that poor character who basically barely exists.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the one thing I want to say, actually, I don't know, like the art for me, like we mentioned, obviously it's by the same author as Your Lie in April, but the first chapter, it looked really bad. Like all the faces looked really atrocious, and I really couldn't get over some of the face design, like just the way it was drawing, the cat was drawing faces. I don't know, maybe it's me, but like part of me is probably because my first interaction was through Your Lie in April and the animated art. But yeah, some of the art, like even though the second volume it comes into full being and you get some really interesting football action shots, a lot of the character art kind of bad, at least to me. Like,
yeah, I think it took a little dialing in, that's for sure. I mean, there certainly is. I think I had that feeling for the first chapter or so, I guess, but then it seems to kind of pick up from that point.
Yeah, that's where my kind of notes stop going, what the hell, constantly. But yeah, I will admit one thing, because you mentioned about the ending and it fell quite flat for you, but I quite enjoyed the ending myself. I mean, it ends like as you say, in a very bittersweet way. But I think it ends in like almost the best bittersweet way, where it's like, oh, like, you know, people have not won here, like people have lost, but everyone's like maybe got something to go with from here. Like people have learned something, and someone's also picked up an injury. But I don't know. Can you grok with that, Andy, or is that maybe a bit far ahead?
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird one in that I wasn't massively satisfied with the ending, but I remember kind of jotting that down as a note and then kind of sitting back and thinking, okay, so what do I want the ending to be? And I couldn't really come up with anything better because every other kind of possibility would have been like super cheesy and saccharine. In the end, I did end up writing like a subsequent note to that was simply, it's a very football in inverted commas climax. It's like, okay, a team's won, a team's lost, but like, you know, there are lots of individual stories around that, you know, kind of have their own little kind of niches within that narrative. And so, yeah, like I think I've kind of made peace with it as a whole, as kind of the best ending it could probably have been, but it still just felt like there was something missing that I wanted to kind of prod me in the ribs or something. And again, maybe that's another kind of Your Lie in April holdover, because, you know, that series has a tremendous ending, which is, you know, utterly heartbreaking, but it is like tremendous and memorable. And it's probably incredibly unfair to expect a story about football to kind of match something like that, especially a 2-volume story about football. So yeah, like I'm willing to give it that.
Sorry. At the same time, like at the risk of being crucified, like I still feel that Your Lie in April has one too many different cycles to its plot structure. Like I feel like at one point, anyway, that's a different conversation. I feel like in some regards, like some of the reason why I felt like this was like a find replace of Your Lie in April, like, you know, Your Lie in the penalty area or something, is that like it did feel slightly find replacey. Like it's like, okay, like this character can be slipped out here, this plot event can be adjusted from a recital to a football match, and whoop, here we go, 2-volume manga. Maybe I'm just being mean. In fact, I feel quite mean now, but still, it's at the same time, like I'm very, very meh on it, but it was still an okay read. Like I tell you one thing, I'm very glad it was 2 volumes because I would not have read a page more, frankly. Like, there is no need to continue this manga beyond this point. And if anything, you could probably make an argument you could carve it down a wee bit. But I'm not a manga author. I'm just a podcaster. So what do I know?
Yeah, I definitely had that kind of train of thought of like, well, you know, maybe if they kind of spun it out into, you know, Onda's journey to be the pinnacle of women's football, maybe that would have given it more. But then it's like, I don't think I'd want to read, like, you know. At the
same time, that's not something I'm interested in.
Exactly.
Like, yeah, the one thing I will admit is that towards the end of the first volume, as mentioned, it was getting pretty hard going. But then, as mentioned, the twist happens, and I was like, oh no, I'm on board. Yep, cool. Yep, fine. Let's read volume 2 in this cafe. So
I think once it gets to that kind of on pitch stuff, it kind of has. It just naturally has something to kind of keep it chugging along at that point, because, you know, you're very much focused within that kind of within the boundaries of that pitch and that match, and that's satisfying in its own way.
Well, it has a lot stronger vehicle for what it wants to impart, both through the beautiful game and the like stories therein. So it works really well. So hooray, football!
Indeed.
Yeah, cool. So. Yeah, that was Sayonara Football. I forgot to mention at the top, so apologies. As mentioned, it's by Naoshi Arakawa. It's a 2-volume manga. It's complete. It's been released by Kodansha. You can buy it from all good digital comic stores, Comixology, Amazon, Kobo, Bookwalker, all good, all available. So yeah, that's available if you so fancy. I would maybe say if it's on sale, pick it up then. It's worth your time, like especially if you are a fan of Naoshi Arakawa's other work. Would you subscribe to that, Andy?
Yeah, I think so. And I think similarly, like if you are like a big football guy like me, there is a decent amount that you can get out of it just from that point of view as well. Because, like I say, a lot of football manga and anime can be kind of clunky. Like this, at least feels like it's dialed into, you know, what the game is all about in some fundamental ways that makes it more satisfying.
So given we're now in an age of anime co-productions, are we going to see a Maria of the Rovers anime series?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like many moons ago we kind of had that discussion where I was basically called an old man for remembering Roy of the Rovers. So I suspect it's
that was in fact me calling you an old man on a previous podcast we hosted.
Yeah, so like I think something like that has probably aged out. But yeah, I should really get back to reading the Giant Killing manga because like that had some real bad localization issues. But like that was that is a good football story as well. So maybe one day I shall get back on that train.
I still have volume 1 on my tablet, and it's really hard to read. I don't know why. It's just so exhausting, and the characters look so gross. Oh,
yeah. It does not have the best art style.
Yeah. Oh, it's so. Oh, anyway, whatever. That's for another podcast, most likely. If we want to like fling that at each other. Cool. So moving on to our second title, and this was the Elliot Page. This wins the Elliot Page Self-Inflicted Injury Award, I suppose. So I decided that I'd pull off the band-aid of our first light novel, given that we had threatened each other with doing a light novel. And so this is by J Novel Club. It is the title, An Archdemon's Dilemma, How to Love Your Elf Bride. The author is Fuminori Teshima, and it's illustrated like for the 6 or so pictures and the cover art by Comta, which I think is a pseudonym, most likely. It's currently ongoing. The second volume just came out in English. It's available ongoing in chapters on J Novel Club, and it's up to 5 volumes in Japan, and it's still going. You can get it from J Novel Club, unsurprisingly, and also from all good ebook sites. So it's a light novel. Like, I'm very sorry to cop out right from the get-go, but basically, dude who's a bit of a recluse, he's much in the mold of the sort of misanthropic / Kyon character from Haruhi of Haruhi fame, who is a demon lord. Well, no, he's actually just a sorcerer. Sorcerers are like magic wielders in this world. Magic's looked down upon, and yet everyone and their dog appears to be doing magic. Whatever, who cares? So he lives on his own in a forest, in a castle that he nicked off someone else. You find out why later. And his mate comes along and says, "Hey, want to come to an auction?" And he goes, "Yeah, sure." So he goes to the auction, and this old magic millionaire dude died and left all his stuff for auction. And in the auction is an elf girl who is like stuck in a slave clothes, whatever. Main character whose name I have, Zagan. That's it. Main character's name is Zagan. Zagan falls in love with her, immediately bets his entire fortune as the opening bid on this poor creature. That's a bit of a losing move if I've ever seen one, if you've ever been on eBay. And so he then gets an elf. Congratulations, you've won this poor little elf girl who's really quiet and withdrawn because, unsurprisingly, she's expected to be murdered and used as a catalyst for a magical spell. So he gets this elf home and is really, really, really shy about the whole thing. And after getting over the fact that, like, no, I'm not going to kill you. No, I'm not going to use you as a toy. No, I'm not going to make you wear rags all the time. They then slowly start to become friends, kind of. The main character is extremely privated. He grew up he had the whole generic light novel, harsh childhood thing that makes him more believable and more human. And basically, he's not very good or socialized at all. Even his best friend, quote unquote, is also a complete pillock. And he ends up fighting off some randos who try to trespass on his property. And unsurprisingly, Elf Girl has her own powers. And Elf Girl's name, by the way, is Neffy, because I can't pronounce her full name. So Neffy does fine. That's the nickname she gets. And it goes through a bunch of individual arcs. There's like 5 or so chapters, each of which has a very small micro light novelish plot line. And it kind of hits a lot of the generic sort of things. Like they go to town, introduces her to society. Main character, as I say, gets attacked and has to fend off the attacker. One of the attackers falls in love with him, kind of, and is like hyper tsundere, who'd have thought. And it kind of goes through this really weird arc. And then towards the end of the volume, it basically kind of realizes it's running out of road and like pulls the ripcord on what you'd assume would be a later storyline. And it kind of goes all out, but then immediately reels the whole thing back in again because you need some material for volume 2. And the whole thing is just really, really, really kind of, it's the stereotypical light novel plot. Like it feels very stereotypical. The whole thing feels very light novelish in terms of writing. It's the sort of writing you associate with light novels somewhat derisively because it's there and it happens. The main character is very much the case of like, oh, hey, I'm an evil guy, but I have a code of honor. And even though I murder like 8 people during this volume, you're not supposed to really think about that whatsoever, and no one really cares. But I had a screwed up upbringing, so that's fine. And also, he has all these magical powers. He's a sorcerer, at least. But he has so much plot armor that is just like, oh, by the way, I have that. And then that turns out to be the most broken-ass thing possible you can do in the boundaries of the world set. And so does this little, like, elf lass he picked up. So yeah, it's really has to scrabble for some form of tension, and whenever it does find something, it immediately pisses it away. Like, no tension whatsoever. It's really stupid. Like, the character interactions go from 0 to 500 to 0 again very quickly. It's just really quite ploddy. It does this irritating, like, light novel two-step, and I'm going to stop talking a minute. I'm sorry, Andy, let you get a word in. But it does the irritating light novel two-step, which I've more and more started realizing and detecting and hate, where it will say a thing, like in one line, and then 3 more lines in the paragraph will be it dancing around with a thesaurus, like basically rewriting that and illuminate, kind of talking more about it, but not actually saying anything. And it's so irritating because it's like, oh, so-and-so was a village. Do village. And it's like, god damn, get on with it. Like, holy shit. So, like, it has that kind of prose, which it just feels constantly like it's padding out an essay for teacher because they're 1,000 words short of the word limit to hand in. And yeah, as I say, it's very exhausting. I mean, at the same time, there is like a small husk in the middle of it being somewhat interesting where, like, oh, both the main characters are a bit messed up. He has his own problems. The elf girl's a bit messed up because she's been really maltreated. And then she has her tragic past, which is somehow even more messed up than the main characters. And I kind of came away going, yeah, I don't really care about any of these characters, but this was kind of a dumb read. And so I'm okay with it. But at the same time, I'm not going to read a single word more of it if I can help it, especially given the way it ends right at the end when it's like, okay, everything's sorted. Oh, wait, no, we need to show the main character is still the bee's knees. Here we go. Here's something that you'd expect to be in volume 5. Done. And then it kind of ends, and bleh. But anyway, sorry, I kind of talked a mile a minute there, Andy. What did you think of it? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to sum it up in 2 words, those words would be utter garbage.
Oh, wow.
I absolutely hated this book. I mean, at its core, it is kind of, as you've alluded to, it is a wish fulfillment power fantasy. And like, that's not a bad thing necessarily. Like, you can have good ones of those, and like, I'm somebody who can enjoy some of those myself. Like, I like a bit of Sword Art Online. I mean,
boo.
Indeed, ReZero, has does some interesting kind of twists on that, but ultimately, it's very much in the same kind of the same kind of genre as a whole. But like, there was nothing that I could find to like about this. I mean, as you noted, like, the main character is a bad guy who's, he's not that bad really, but he keeps going around and murdering people. And I think that was one of the things that kind of frustrated me the most, because the book is incessantly trying to sell him as not such a bad guy really, but then he spends most of his time being a jerk. And it's like...
Like, it's not even just being a jerk. Like, he tries to dress it up, a lot of his jerkishness as being socially maladjusted, which is accurate. But equally, like, he just turns like 5 different people minimum into blood sausage. Like, they literally ceased to exist in the book's own words. Like, that's not cool. Like, what?
Yeah, exactly. And it's very strange in the way that it kind of it writes that stuff up. Like, it feels completely sort of blind to the fact that maybe some of this behavior is not actually kind of, good or against any kind of honorable code whatsoever. And it just kind of carries on down that road. And then, you have the whole slavery angle, which there were numerous points in this book where I felt like it was potentially going to do something interesting with that. I mean, as you mentioned, like, there's a big reveal that kind of Neffy has powers of her own. I was like, okay, this is kind of potentially an interesting turning point, because we've got this kind of master-slave relationship. It turns out that the slave actually has some pretty vast powers of her own that perhaps, are perhaps better than those of her masters. Like, how does this change the dynamic? Like, what does this do to these 2 characters and the way they interact with each other and how they see each other? And the answer is, it basically does nothing with it, which, felt like a missed opportunity. And then, I mean, again, kind of going back to this, I'm not a bad guy whole kind of problem, you know, I was kind of hopeful that there's a point, and this is something of a spoiler, so be warned, but like there's a point where, you know, Neffy kind of starts out wearing this collar that kind of prevents her using any kind of magic, and that's kind of like her one. It's the one thing that kind of is left as a remnant of her place as a slave, basically. Mostly because Zagan doesn't know how to remove it. So there's a point where he manages to figure that out. He removes the collar, and I'm like, okay, that's cool. Like that kind of signifies something in terms of changing that relationship in a way that I feel happier with than the whole, like, you know, my slave bride angle that it was playing at initially. But then you get towards the end of the volume, and there's basically a point where she asks to have that collar put back on, which in itself is like, you know, like allowed at that point. But again, there's a point there where Zagan could have said, like, no, you know what, no, like that signifies an element to our relationship that is no longer there. Like, you're no longer in any way, shape, or form my slave. I'm not going to put that back on you. Don't be stupid. But instead, he's like, oh, okay, then sure, I'll put that back on you. And so, you know, we kind of return to that initial kind of power fantasy dynamic of like, oh yeah, by the way, I am your master at the end of the day. So, hey, oh, and like that really kind of riled me up, because again, it could have been an interesting moment to kind of subvert the starting point of the story, but instead it just reverts to type of just like, oh yeah, like, isn't this kind of hot that like he's still in charge? And it's like, oh, please.
But no, Andy, now she wants it, you know, like,
yeah, which only serves to make that worse.
But there's like a conversation at one point where like again, mild spoilers, but basically Zagan like basically throws her away. And like they have this really irritating conversation between like Neffy, the like rando like swords lady who is a prodigy beyond prodigies in the church, and yet somehow she gets the hots for this fucking moron living in a castle in the woods who she's supposed to kill, and by all rights should probably have all justification in killing because he's murdered 6 people like in front of her, and you know. And then they all just have this conversation, just basically fawning in different levels over him and his treatment of her. And it's like, yeah, but he is still making her be a slave. Like, what is this? It's real wild. So
yeah, and there's also the whole part with kind of like the early sort of relationship with Neffy. Like, there's a point where she kind of says like, look, I want to do some stuff around here. I don't just want to like hang about. Like, what can I do to help you, you know, with your daily activities? And of course, the two things he comes up with is like, well, I guess you could cook and clean for me. It's like, oh, great. Well, fantastic. That's exactly the kind of gender equality we like to see in our light novels.
And then I'm going to even subvert that by making you feel hella awkward by basically perving over you constantly. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
The whole, it's irritating in that regard. Sorry, Andy, but it kind of falls into this really perverted but still excruciatingly chaste way of presenting it, where it's like, oh, you know, I'm not a bad guy because I'm not lusting after. It's like, yeah, but you're still fucking things up royally and taking away every last piece of initiative she might have, and, you know, dressing it up as you being like, actually, that's a separate thing I meant to say. Sorry, Andy, but it has multiple Monogatari style or attempted like digressions into moralization, which are all hot garbage. Like, I mean, I've read Fate graphic light novels and visual novels, and those have a lot of like fucking main character talking a load of shit about his moral like decisions. And this Zagan does the same thing, and it's just like, shut up, dude. Like, all this stuff is like talking out your ass and like contradicting what you said the last time you started talking out of your ass. Like, at that point, I was actually getting to the point where I was just flipping past pages going, no, I don't care to read this anymore. I'm fed up of reading your idiot moralization because the author realized he's written himself in a corner or subverted his own character.
Yeah, and again, a lot of that kind of perving over Neffy as well also kind of gets written under the excuse of like, oh, well, he's just socially awkward. Like, you know, there's only one chair in this room and he's asked her to sit on his lap because he's just socially awkward and he doesn't know how else to handle this situation. And it's like, no, come on, like, let's not kind of dress this up as something that it's not. Like, at least own your perviness.
But it tries so hard, Andy. It's trying so hard.
And I think that's the problem. It's like, if you're going to do the pervy stuff, just do it. Just like, just own that stuff. Don't try and kind of, dress it up as something that it isn't. And again, I mean, to kind of make the Monogatari comparisons, like, that's sort of one of the weirdly refreshing things about that series, apart from the fact that it's kind of parodying exactly this kind of thing when it goes there. But, that series goes down that pervy route, and it just owns it. It's just like, yeah, this is the main character being a complete hornball. What do you want me to do about it? And it doesn't try and dress that up, or it does it in a way that is this kind of very knowing, jokey way of like, well, this obviously isn't why this stuff is happening. So let's just move on with it. So yeah, just like and that almost is kind of the problem with so much of this book. Is just like just be open about what you want to be. Don't bullshit around it. It's clear what you want to do and what you want to offer readers. So don't try to dress it up in all these various ways. Like, it is what it is. So just get on with it.
Yeah, it does it. Yeah, I think you've definitely really helped illuminate it there, where like it constantly talks about the limitations of sorcery, and yet the main character annihilates absolutely everyone in his path, like effortlessly, while doing like, you can almost see him crossing his arms and doing the like novel cool guy, sort of lean almost.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean, I will say that is the one part that I did kind of like about this novel, is the way it's kind of built up its whole magic system. It's like that stuff was kind of like just like different enough to be kind of interesting, and I like the sort of slightly weird, almost like Ghost in the Shell-esque way of like, well, you can hack other people's magic circles, but you can also build systems to prevent that hacking, or set up traps within it. And it's like, that's actually an interesting system. And had they not done exactly what you mentioned about them kind of making the main character totally overpowered in how he uses that stuff, like, that could have been a really interesting kind of concept for all of the action-oriented stuff throughout the series, where you could have this really good kind of cat and mouse, who can best who in terms of like using this weird sort of magic technology. But again, it kind of breaks that system instantly by having like ridiculously powerful characters in it.
Yeah, I feel like it's almost the like, I'm going to make a really specific reference here, but I remember you telling me about this before, and I ended up watching it myself. But do you remember No Game No Life, where they have that like reality shiritori thing? Yeah. Where they're like making things come into existence and vanish out of existence based on a wordplay game. I feel like the sorcery in this light novel thinks it's at that level, but at the same time it's too impatient, and so just jumps straight to Zagan murders everyone, which makes it really boring, because it's like, oh, he won. Like at the end, okay, so again, minor spoiler, but at the end, everything's resolved. Everything is resolved. And then suddenly, oh no, a demon shows up, and then it immediately bows down to Zagan. And then 2 lines later, it's been dispelled. It's like, what the fuck? Like, why even bother? Like, why even bother? Why did you do that? And yeah, it's both the fact that it very much is having its cake and eating it in all regards, from like the character interrelationships and everything. It's so, yeah. It's at the same time, there is every now and then that I found it perfectly okay to read as a very easy, light piece of whatever. But at the same time, especially now I'm talking about it, it's just like, man, Christ alive, it's garbage. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, especially in a genre that is kind of so jam-packed with offerings, especially these days where you've got J Novel Club, releasing a crazy amount of stuff, and there are a whole other set of companies, who are bringing various light novels to the West. You are not spoiled for choice if you want, if you want your wish fulfillment, or if you want your kind of fantasy world stuff. Like, you have never been more spoiled, and this definitely sits in kind of the lower end of the stuff that I've seen and read as far as that goes. Yeah,
I mean, there is at least that to say, is that we're not in the weird old doldrums where you had to walk 15 miles uphill both ways to get a light novel. You can go on J Novel Club and basically drown yourself in a complete vat of. We have some questions about it. We have one question from regular Demel's Award. Thank you again for messaging in. So apparently it was this title was originally licensed and going to be released as a slightly adjusted name of an Archdemon's Dilemma, How to Love Your Slave Elf Bride. Slave being the extra name that was eventually cut out. And so what did we think about the name change? And I'm saying, well, I think taking the word slave out is perfectly fine optics, especially given that they don't hide that in the synopsis. So I don't really think that's awful. I mean, hell, you look at the Japanese transliterated light novel title and it's from the first person sort of thing, like every other one. It's like, oh, damn, I'm an archdemon and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. I think in terms of kind of the general, like, this is also where certainly, like, I kind of sit in a weird place of just like, oh, like, Elliot's picked this thing, I have to read it. Like, had that been the initial title, like, my eyebrow would have raised several inches higher when you suggested it, for sure. So yeah, like, the addition of that word might have made a difference in terms of that. But yeah, I think if you're the average person who's browsing J Novel Club or Amazon or wherever, the assumption is that you're probably going to either A, know what the series is, or B, read the synopsis where it is very clear that, like, oh yeah, she's a slave girl, and that's that isn't completely hidden from view. But yeah, I mean, if you are literally looking at a title alone, then I would have had a different reaction to it had the word slave been in the title from the get-go.
Okay, fair. Yeah, I mean, I generally just skip straight to synopses for light novels nowadays because the titles, like, they're often rather... It's a case where it's like, okay, what is actually in this beyond this bombastic, hilarious title? Yeah, cool.
Yes.
Okay,
Indeed.
so, yeah, man, sorry for putting you through that, Andy. I did warn you.
No, I mean, it was interesting. Like, I mean, there are so many of these kind of stories now, like that I just kind of, I automatically roll my eyes at them, and it's probably kind of unfair because I'm sure there's some good ones out there. So I'm all for trying new things.
Okay, moving on. What we can talk about next time. So we've got another light novel on here because we both hate ourselves, I guess. Although it's not my fault this time. I have nominated, as it's finally out digitally, and I don't need to buy a £14 hardback for it. It's A Bride Story, Volume 1 by Kaoru Mori, which is set in Asia Minor, I guess, the Near East. I forget the proper term for that area of the world. Which is by Kaoru Mori, who is a master magician, mage, wizard, about drawing things. She's an amazing artist. And this is about like a turn of the century, 1900s journey into a girl who is the daughter of a nomadic tribe who is married off to a local merchant's son, and the age gap, like, sort of cultural dance that occurs therein. I'm down for it no matter what because it's Kaoru Mori, and I will read anything she puts out because holy shit. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading this, and using Andy as an excuse to buy a volume.
Just to be clear, she's neither an elf bride nor a slave bride. I just want to be sure of that.
No, she's not a slave, but it is an arranged marriage. But that's kind of typical of the time and period.
That's fine. I can deal with that.
It has, from having skimmed it before, it has a much more enlightened view on everything. So it also, at the very least, it's a lot more empathetic because Kaoru Mori. So anyway, how about you, Andy?
Yes, as noted, given that you pulled off the light novel Band-Aid for this podcast, I'm now rapidly pouring salt into the gaping wound because I picked a light novel myself this time. And that light novel it's kind of almost not a light novel because it is Last and First Idol. So it is actually a collection of several short stories. So I'm gonna go with that and say I didn't pick a light novel at all, which is not really as much about idols as it purports to be. Like, it has a very hard science fiction bent to it, and I've seen some glowing discussion of it, and it sounds very interesting and intriguing and like my kind of thing. So I figured, why not?
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I've seen quite a few people sort of mentioning it and posting like lines from it, and I'm like, okay, yeah, no, this certainly seems like something interesting and up my alley. At the very least, it seems like it'd be funny. So I can get down with that. Cool. So I had a look at what's coming up in the world of manga over the next 2 weeks, and I frankly, honestly couldn't see much. So we can skip over that section unless you want something to call out, Andy.
I've got to admit, I've not actually looked at the schedule, so I should take a quick look. But if you don't see anything good, then I very much doubt that I will be. And yeah, given that the first thing I've seen is Bad Boy: Night of the Scattered Pearls, I think we're probably safe for this time.
Cool. Okay, so moving on into Closedown. You can find our website at Screentone.club. You can see all our previous episodes, our show notes, timings, in case you want to make sure you avoid spoilers or jump to the series you want to hear about. As mentioned, there'll be a link on there to our newly launched Patreon, which hopefully, barring me screwing it up royally, will be live at the time of this show going live. The podcast can also be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbay, I think, Stitcher, I think. It should be on there. It was the last time I looked. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend, tweet about it maybe, leave a review if you so fancy. I know we're asking an awful lot of you. Well, I'm asking a lot of you. Andy's staying good and polite and quiet. But yeah, it'd be really appreciated because that's the easiest way and most powerful way of getting more people onto the show. You can find our Twitter at Screentone Club. We receive and ask for questions through there for future episodes. If you've got thoughts on the upcoming titles, let us know. We've also got an email address, which is show@screentone.club. So send your email over there if you so fancy, and I'll have a look at it and we can get back to you. So personal stuff. I'm Elliot Page. You can find my stuff on moash.it. Also on Manga Search. So that's manga sear.ch. That should be live and actually functional again shortly once I can kick Python in the face. And Andy, how about you?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter, where I am at Hannahs1979.
Cool. So yeah, thank you very much for listening once again. And yeah, we will see you again you'll hear from us again in 2 weeks. So thank you very much for listening and good night.
Bye, everyone.